I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then I'm going to open the floor, and if you have any questions, feel free to grab the ball and ask away. I live in Paris, in France. I've been in France for the past 10 years, but I was born and raised in London. And in the 1980s, in London, we didn't know what high-functioning autism was, and even less what savantism was. So when I was growing up, my parents didn't know even what word to apply to me. I was either highly sensitive, awkward, cack-handed, as my father would say. But what I had in my mind was what Julian was talking about, augmented reality. I had my own form of augmented reality in my head because I found it very difficult to relate to other people. And for reasons that would become clear, scientists would explain to me. But when I looked at books, I was completely at ease, and I felt at home in books. And when I went to the library, my parents were very poor. We didn't have any money for theatres or cinema and so on, but the library is free of charge, of course, for everyone. So I would go there every day after school, and I would read for many hours. And what I would see in my head is when I opened the book and I saw the words and the numbers, I would see colours, I would see shapes, I would see textures, I would even experience emotions and have a relationship, almost a personal relationship with the information. And this is a condition that scientists, a neurological phenomenon that scientists call synesthesia. And synesthesia is a mixing of the senses. Normally in the brain, we have different regions, and each region is dedicated more or less to a different different region of information. So you have a part of your brain that's dedicated to color, a part of the brain that's dedicated to facial recognition, a part of the brain that's dedicated to the language, and so on. And what's happening in my brain is that cutting off, I would say, of different parts of information, not allowing them to come together, is not present in my brain. The information just goes where it needs to go, where it wants to go. So that colors and numbers speak together, and words and faces, the emotional response that we have when we look at a face that we like or we love or we know, that emotional response I get from words as well, and so on. And synesthesia is interesting because we now know that it's related to autism, that when you're born on the autistic spectrum, you have a surplus of connections, neurological connections in the brain, and that in most people, these connections, which we all have at birth, the surplus connections are very quickly pruned down to avoid the risk of epilepsy, for example. I had epileptic seizures as a small child, which is also very common in autism. Unfortunately, grew out of those very quickly with medical treatment. And synesthesia, we also know, is related to creativity. There have been tests that show that you're 7 times more likely as a synesthete to be creative, highly creative, an artist like myself, a writer, a poet, and so on, a sculptor, a musician, and synesthetic than not. And this synesthesia, in a way, helped me to overcome my autism. It gave me the material I would need as I got older to work around what could have been a handicap. Because in autism, it's a developmental condition. There are many forms of autism, probably as many types as there are people with the condition. And so on the one end of the spectrum, you have individuals who can't speak at all and who are very stereotypical in their behaviours. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have people like Les Murray, who is an Australian poet. And if you ever come across his name, it's because every October he's among the favourites for the Nobel Prize. When we say I'm a translator, it's also because I've translated Les Murray's poetry into French. And obviously I'm on that end of the spectrum with Les Murray. And so it's a fascinating condition. incredibly complex, because the brain is incredibly complex. There was many connections, more connections in the brain than there are atoms in the universe, for example. And so reading, I would see these colors and textures and so on from words, like Nabokov, the writer of Lolita, for example, who chose the word Lolita because the colors reminded him of a butterfly. He was also a huge collector of butterflies, fan of butterflies, and the particular patterns of colors on the butterfly that he particularly loved was the pattern that he saw in the name Lolita, which is why he named his most famous work Lolita. When I write, I also have this very aesthetic relationship to language. I can feel the sentences as I write them, and if a sentence feels too heavy or too light, or if the words are too dark or too then I too textured, or I work with them almost like a sculptor. I'm taking the words, I'm moulding what I'm experiencing in order to make the prose as smooth and as light and as clean as possible. And numbers in particular are something that have followed me ever since my childhood, because every page in the book obviously has a number. Books are mathematical objects. They have beginnings, they have obviously middles, they have ends, they have a structure that is mathematical. And to tell a story is mathematical. We use the word bank tellers. The original meaning of to tell was to count. So when I looked at numbers, I would see stories, because the numbers were not just squiggles of ink on the page. They had colors and textures and emotions and personalities, and the shapes were like ideograms, what we call in linguistics ideograms. In Chinese or Japanese, if you ask someone to draw complexity or inspiration or hope, they will draw the shape of hope and complexity and so on, using their language, ideograms. And what I was doing with my mind, without knowing it, was seeing in numbers a language, a private language of numerical ideograms. So the shapes of, for example, the number 4 had a particular shape, a pointy shape, and the color was blue, and it meant shyness, timidity. I don't know why, but it did. And I, growing up, thought of myself as the number 4. Whereas the number, 26, for example. 26 would be a number that when I felt sleepy in my mind, I wouldn't say I'm feeling sleepy. I would say to myself 26, and 26 meant I'm sleepy. I want to go to bed, because it's the double of 13, and 13 is a number that's descending and sort of like a waterfall. And multiplying it by 2 for some reason that is proper to my particular numerical grammar means I'm sleepy. My favorite example is the number, because it's a word that doesn't exist in any other language. It only exists in my language. It's the number 757. I mean, to you it's 757, but for me it's a shape. It looks like a ginger root. When I do my shopping in Paris, when I look at the ginger, I immediately see this idea in my head. And 757, this shape, means, it's a very complex meaning. It is to both be incredibly alone, feel incredibly alone, and at the same time not have the social capacity to come out of this solitude. And this very specific emotion, I think, is very common to individuals on the autistic spectrum. Something that I grew up with for a long time, had great difficulty overcoming. And books both gave me that stimulation in terms of my synesthesia, in terms of how I experienced it almost as another world. And at the same time, it was also stimulating in a much more pragmatic way, because as I got older and I grew out of dictionaries and encyclopedias and so on, I would turn to novels. And even though I didn't really understand the emotions and the situations in the novels very easily, I would be mugging up on dialogue in them. I would be using them almost like a teach-yourself conversation manner. And so I was reading to gain what we call empathy. And this is something that didn't come easily to me. But reading fiction and reading poetry as well was a way of getting inside other people's minds. It was a way of discovering that my way of perceiving the world wasn't the only one, and that it explained in part the great difference that I felt intuitively, that separated myself, my way of feeling and being in the world, and that of my classmates and my teachers and my parents, my brothers and sisters. And so I was able to use novels and poetry to develop this empathy, little by little, and to take the dialogue into the playground with me and to try and use it in a very scientific manner, I would say, because I would be trying it out, and of course like an experiment, and of course it would go terribly wrong sometimes because people don't speak as the words appear in books from the 1950s and the 1960s and novels. But still, I could learn from my mistakes. And every time that I made a mistake, I got it wrong, I didn't know what was being said or how it was coming out and so on, I would learn from that experience and come back the stronger for it and make fewer mistakes and go on in this way, very empirical way of acquiring social pragmatic language. And at school I did very well. This is the upside of my autism, that I did very well. I was a very quick learner. And as soon as I discovered French and German, I was delighted, because one of the difficulties that we have on the autistic spectrum is you feel like you're a foreigner. You are a foreigner. Nobody in England, the England that I was raised in, spoke in my language of numbers, and I couldn't speak the English that my siblings and the classmates could speak so fluently, so easily. So I was a foreigner. To all intents and purposes, I was a foreigner. I was treated like a foreigner. And it's why, as I got older, I decided to leave England. And I come back as a tourist. I'm very happy to come back and speak in English. But I, live in France. I've been in France for 10 years. I speak in French. And it's for that reason, actually, because, feeling always like a foreigner in my own country, it was important for me, once I could, to actually leave and find another country, another language. And French and German and other foreign languages later, because I communicate in 6 or 7 languages. And this, in part, this passion for language is also rooted in my childhood and the need that I had for finding other ways of expressing myself and feeling less a foreigner, strangely, feeling less a foreigner when I speak in French than when I speak in English, to you now. And it was also at school, when I was in my early teens, that I discovered the number pi. For those who, I'm sure you know more or less what the number pi is, it's the most famous number in mathematics. It describes the relationship between a circle's circumference and its diameter. And this number is what mathematicians call infinite. It literally goes on forever in the decimal expression. And at school, we were introduced to this number, and the idea of a number that went on forever, for me, was pure poetry. It just completely spoke to me. And I was very frustrated because we were only given the first 4 or 5 digits, 31415. And I thought, well, this is like being introduced to Shakespeare and being given 4 words of Shakespeare. And so I went to my trusted library and I looked around, and I found eventually in one of the encyclopedias, this was before the era of the internet, I managed to find a few hundred numbers of pi in an encyclopedia, and I learned them by heart, as you learn Shakespeare by heart, because for me it was a language, and I could find in the digits of pi, even though they are random, strictly speaking, there's no pattern as such, but the pattern was one that I could find, my mind could impose, because of the virtue of the language, that I could visualize the numbers in. And the first line of Pi, so to speak, is just incredible. It's the story of a man who steps into like a countryside, and as he steps, he thinks he's going to come to an end. It's going to finish. There's no more landscape, and he suddenly sees the hill falling away from him, and there's this amazing new vista opens up to him, full of light, full of beauty. And this is the first digits of Pi, how I see it in my mind. So this is another universe, a beautiful world of poetry, internal numerical poetry. And as I got older, this poetry obviously stayed with me. And after I left school, and I taught for a year overseas, because again, going overseas was a way of compensating for my eccentricities. I had an excuse every time that I was a little bit odd. I could say I'm British, and it just immediately worked. So, and when I came back, I was in Eastern Europe, in Lithuania. When I came back from Lithuania, and for a time I was tutoring in English and tutoring in mathematics, and I didn't know what to do. I was at a standstill, and I decided I would go back to Pi. There was the internet by then, so I went onto the internet and I found a supercomputer in Japan that's only sole function was to spit out the decimals of Pi. And it had calculated billions, trillions of digits of Pi. So I was able to print out by the 1,000 these decimals of Pi. And I just spent one winter when I was in my early 20s just learning this story, this poetry, this epic. Not in numbers, not in English, not in French, like Shakespeare or Rimbaud, but in numbers, the language of numbers, my language. And I was learning this amazing poetry. And then I didn't know what to do with it, because usually when you have a work of art, you go to a museum and you expose it, you put it up on a wall, you hang it on a wall. Well, the art was in my head. So I contacted the National Society for Epilepsy. They were wonderful and helped organize an event, a public event in Oxford on March 14th, 2004. March 14th, of course, Pi Day in America, 314, 14th day of March. And for 5 hours and 9 minutes, I sat in front of a group of mathematicians who had the very boring task of having to check every single digit, because it was also a record attempt. It set a European record. And at the public, there had been an article the day before in the Times of London and about my story, about what I was about, what I was doing here. And they were so curious, people. They just came. And they came from all walks of life. There were mathematicians, of course, but there were also, and university lecturers, but there were also housewives and students and tourists, American tourists with their Mickey Mouse hat, I remember very well. And they all came and they listened. And what was amazing about this experience, so I was reciting the poetry of Pi, obviously speaking in numbers, no other language, my own language, but because it was embodied by a young man, by my voice, by my breath, by my person, my story, my personal story. It was something that people could relate to and find meaning, their own meaning within. And as I got further into the numbers, I wasn't like a machine just spitting out numbers. There was a texture, there was a rhythm, there was like a poet who recites his poetry. There were moments when I slowed down, there were moments when I sped up, there were moments when I was putting, without noticing, emphasis because the numbers were particularly heavy, particularly loud, or particularly dark in my mouth. And moments when the numbers were much lighter, much colder, and so I was reciting differently. And intuitively, the public were picking up on these clues and were able to relate. There was a sort of complicity that created itself as I went on. And it reached a point where there were people even with tears in their eyes because they were just very moved by this experience. And I realized at this point that I had a gift, I had a vocation, which was not just to count, but to recount, that I could actually communicate, that all of my difficulty with language, all those years growing up, and struggling with words and struggling with the pragmatics of language and making myself understood, understanding other people, that this had become a struggle, but in the struggle it had become a passion. And because it had become a passion, something I'd become passionate about, I'd wanted at all costs to master, and had reached a point where I could, use language to a very high level, in fact. Even speaking in numbers, I was able to make myself understood and to really speak directly to the minds and to the hearts of the people in that room on that day in Oxford. And for 5 hours and 9 minutes, it was like eternity was in that room. It was an incredibly powerful experience. And when I came out of that room afterwards, obviously I was transformed. My confidence just went through the roof, as we say in English. And I was approached by a documentary team. They were a team that took me to scientists around the world, in Britain in particular, and also in the United States, to diagnose me, to do many brain scans and different tests on how my brain works, how my perceptions work, how my synesthesia works. And then because they found out that I loved language and I had this facility for language, they said, can we take you to a country that you don't know and give you 1 week in that country and acquire the language? And I said, I don't know. I've never tried. So they took me to Iceland and they gave me a teacher. And the wonderful thing was that there was an emotional connection immediately between myself and this lady who teaches Icelandic to foreigners, to such a point that when I was married 2 years ago, she came with her family to Paris and she sang in Icelandic at my wedding. And this, I think without this emotional response, I wouldn't have been able to learn Icelandic at all. It's a very intuitive process. It's not something that I analyze point by point. And the emotion has to be there. And it's something that I can't teach, insofar as I can obviously teach certain ideas, but I can't teach the emotion. The emotion has to come from each individual. And what I try to do when people ask me, how to do this, I say, first of all, try to find the emotion within you, the emotional reason that you need to want to do this, to want to acquire Icelandic or want to recite Pi or whatever it is you want to do. And by virtue of my background, by virtue of having this vocation, the emotion was there. And we got on so well with my tutor, Icelandic tutor, and that after a week in Reykjavik, they took me onto television and I gave the interview in Icelandic. I'm sure there were mistakes. I'm sure my accent wasn't perfect, but apparently it was good Icelandic and I understood everything. So, and to this day I use my Icelandic and I'm able to read original Icelandic literature, which is a great privilege. And so it's strange because what could have been a handicap and what is, I must acknowledge it immediately, a handicap for many people around the world, in the end for me is a gift. And if someone had said to me as a child, do you want to be different? I would have said no. I won't take all this away from me. I want to be like every other kid. I just want to have friends and just play in the playground and get on with my life. But now if someone says to me, do you want to go back and do it differently? I would say no, not in a million years. Because I would never have had the experiences that I've had I not had the background that I had, the life that I've led. I wouldn't have written the books that I've gone on to write. Sean mentioned that I'm the author of different books, essayist, novelist, translator. I've translated poetry, world-class poetry by Les Murray, one of the Nobel Prize candidates. I've written, here's a few of my books. Born on a Blue Day was my first book. I was born on a Wednesday, and Wednesdays are blue, hence the title of the book. This was my first book. It was a memoir of my childhood, and it became a worldwide bestseller. My second book was Embracing the Wide Sky. It's about how the brain works, mine, but also yours. It's a personal survey of neuroscience. And there are chapters on how we learn language, how we process numbers and mathematics in our minds, how we perceive, how we remember, how memory works. I've also written a book of essays, literary essays inspired by mathematical ideas. So the idea of infinity, for example, which is a fascinating idea. There's an essay about that. And this book is the one that will come out in August. So please look out for it. Every word is a bird we teach to sing. It's a collection of essays on language and languages. It's obviously one of my passions. And what I've done in this book is, first of all, it's partly autobiographical. I explain my numerical language. I give many examples. I explain my relationship to language, how I became a writer. And then I go on and explain in other chapters. What I do is I go out and meet people with extraordinary languages, with extraordinary backgrounds, extraordinary stories, because I feel that I have a way of relating to their stories which is perhaps unique, because from where I come from I have that ability both to be an outsider, to summon up enough objectivity to treat what they're telling me with, as a journalist would, and at the same time from the inside, because I speak many of these languages. I'm able to go inside the community and to interview them. So for example, there's a chapter about Esperanto, which is an artificial language invented over 100 years ago by a Polish eye doctor. And there are people raised in Esperanto. It's a little known fact. There are about 1,000 people in the world that are called denaskuiloi esperantistoi, and it means that they're born speaking Esperanto from birth. So it's their mother tongue. It's one of their mother tongues. As numbers, it's one of my mother tongues. And so I spent 6 months. It's probably the most in-depth sociological experience ever done on Esperanto speakers, just interviewing people in Esperanto. So I'm using Esperanto to interview them directly in their language they were raised in, to find out, how Esperanto works, what does it change in your brain to be raised in an artificial language, and so on. There are chapters on sign language, there are chapters on the French Academy, there are chapters on a language called Manx, which is the language of the Isle of Man, and it's almost dead, almost extinct, and there are a handful of people trying to revive it, and why they revive it, and what does language mean? Because I think in the end, and this is what I'm going to conclude, what language offers us, whether it be numbers, English, sign language, whatever, is the fact that in the end it's not simply words on a page, it's not just a list, it's not just grammar, it's the way that you are in the world, the way that you relate to people, the way that you think, the way that you feel. And it's why it's such a privilege to speak different languages, because each language is a different window that you open up, a different perceptual window you open up on the world. And so it's what I would recommend at the end, my conclusion would be this, learn another language at any age, however well or badly, because it has cognitive benefits, it opens up windows. It might not make you synesthetic, but it will give you different ways of feeling and experiencing and being in the world. And we have one life, but through language, we have as many lives as languages we speak. Thank you.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, and it was
Thank you.
absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
Can I ask you to stay though, because I'm sure people do have questions
Yes,
for
if
you.
you
So who is it? Okay, let's throw a ball up there.
You mentioned that in numbers you felt that they were like pictograms, like Japanese or Chinese, and I've learned, I speak Japanese. Have you ever tried to learn Japanese, or whenever you see characters, do those characters mean, or do you see something in them in the way that you do numbers?
That's a good question. I've never had the opportunity to learn Japanese or Chinese. So if ever I do have the opportunity, I would love to try and see what I experience when I look at kanji and these other forms of pictograms, as you mentioned, or ideograms, and see what I see. I'm sure it'd be both similar in some respects to what you see and what obviously the native speakers see, and different as well. And I think that would be very interesting. So it's certainly something I'll keep in mind for the future.
As a musician, I have a big curiosity, and I don't know if you studied something about the way music is written and what kind of language music is. What happens to me is that I play the 95% of the music I play on the piano by heart. But what happens is that I don't know what I'm playing. Once I learn a music, my body, let's say my hands, know how to do that. But if I think what I do, I don't know, I would say 10 out of 1,000 notes I'm playing.
Yes.
Did you study something about it? What's this phenomenon about?
In terms of music, I'm not a musician. I'd love to be a musician. There are people who are on autistic spectrum savants who are musicians, who are wonderful musicians. And you can find their music online and listen, and I recommend that very much. In terms of what you're experiencing, I think it's what a lot of us experience on one level, which is that there's a point in when we're learning something that if you put too much conscious attention on it, it breaks down. There's a point, in fact, where you have to trust yourself just to go with the flow, so to speak. And in terms of language, it's about, in fact, what happens with language is a fascinating experience, is that the language, as soon as you acquire enough of the language will start thinking for you. And what people often do, a mistake that a lot of people make when they're beginning to learn a language is first of all, they make two mistakes. They learn very slowly, because when you learn at school, you're taught 5 words, and then the next week 5 words, and next week 5. It's too slow. There's no way you can get motivation, and you're not getting any immersion in language. Whereas I would say the opposite. You need to learn as much as possible very quickly, as quickly as possible, even if you struggle, even if it's very difficult at first, because the more information you have at your disposal, the more your mind is able to find patterns, and the more your mind is able to find natural ways of remembering, because it says, oh, this reminds me of this, and this looks like this. And you work out why you say it like this, because this is exactly the same structure. Whereas if you're only learning little by little by little, you don't have that access quickly enough to make those patterns, make those connections. And then the other thing is that you're trying to impose on the language you're learning, the target language, how you think yourself. You're imposing a conscious way of, in Spanish you say, I'm hungry. You don't say, I am hungry. You say, tengo hambre. I have hunger. It's the same in French, j'ai faim. And if you try to say, je suis affamé, but maybe we can say it in French, but I don't think you can say it in Spanish. And it's awkward. It's not a natural way of speaking. So what you need to do is you need to, at some point, let the language think for you. The language becomes almost like a living phenomenon in your mind. And a point will come very quickly if you really immerse yourself in it, where sentences will start making themselves up in your head, and you should trust them. And of course, if you've got the feedback of native speakers, it's perfect, because they might be able to say, well, this is right grammatically, but we would usually probably say it a bit quicker. We'd usually just say it. But that's often a much more natural way of, an intuitive way of learning than to try and impose these patterns that often don't work in the real world.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much, Daniel. My name is Christian. I come from Germany, and I made similar experiences as you, living abroad, opening up, new worlds by language and culture. And you talked about the emotional link you need to access this world.
Yes.
There must be a second factor, which is confidence. Mm-hmm. Is that something that is intrinsically coming from you, self-confidence, or did other people help you by giving you positive feedback and developing confidence?
It's certainly been a development. People pose the question of to what extent talent is innate and to what extent it's acquired. And often you're either on one side or you're on the other side. I don't consider myself a natural genius, or naturally talented. But I wouldn't say it's acquired either, because there hasn't been in my background the desire just to learn for the sake of learning at any point and say I want to do this for this reason, or it's just come as it's come, and it's felt natural at that moment in my life to learn the first 500 digits of pi as a teenager, for example, or to find in French and German, to a lesser extent, a way of experiencing the world that I felt less foreign within. And I would say that in terms of this spectrum, this debate, I would say it's somewhere in the middle, as is often the case, that there is a part of talent which is innate. And I think it's pointless to try to say to someone who's very short, biologically short, say you're going to be a wonderful basketball player. They can play basketball to a good level for fun, but obviously they'll always be at a disadvantage compared to their much taller peers. But this person who's too short maybe for basketball is maybe has just the right disposition in other areas for other sports or other talents. And rather than saying to someone, you can do anything if you put your mind to it. And I think that's a little bit of a false slogan, and it raises expectations too high, and it's the wrong kind of expectations, in fact, because I don't think it's about making them too high, but it's the wrong kind of expectations. I think people have the right to have very high expectations for themselves and their children, but to say to them, you're unique. So you don't have to try and be the next Tiger Woods or the next Nabokov or the next Daniel Tammet or whatever. You have to be yourself. And before even that, you need to find out what that means for you. And what that means for you is a story that you're going to make out of your life, out of the meetings you have, out of the experiences you have, out of the things that you learn, the passions that come out of that. And that's something that can't be taught. And that's where it's innate. And then where it's learned is that pi, I wasn't born with the digits of pi in my head. I wasn't born speaking Icelandic and some German and French and so on. That's obviously I've had to learn. So the passion's there at the beginning to make it possible, and then I've obviously had to learn to, activate, so to speak, that talent.
Hi, Daniel.
Hello.
You were saying that when you start seeing pi number, you have a story, no? With these first 4 or 5 digits, you have a story. When you have the whole digit, or not the whole, but a lot of digits, how the story goes on?
Well, it's very long.
Well, try a little bit.
It's very long. But what was amazing is that it's like when you're reading the Odyssey. I don't know if you've read the Odyssey or the Iliad. And there are moments that are light and beautiful and poetic. And then there are moments of incredible violence. And in Pi, I can reassure you, there are no moments of great violence, but there are moments of fear. Because I think what is happening is that in a way, I was reciting myself. I was reciting the person that I was at 25, the young man that I had become, all of my childhood, all of my background, and all of those experiences, I was putting words, which were numbers, onto those experiences and reciting them and telling my story, who I was, revealing myself completely, absolutely, but with numbers to the room. And what was amazing is, as I said, that the people weren't meant to understand anything. They weren't meant to understand this numerical language, but they did, because we're all human and we all understand what it is: loneliness at some point or another, difference at some point or another, ambition of some kind or another, the desire for connection, the search for meaning, and all of those came across very, very strongly. And I think if I'd learned enough Japanese and recited in Japanese, it would have been the same. Because those emotions come through. If you watch a film in a foreign language you don't understand and you don't have the subtitles go down, you don't have them. It's enough just to see the pictures and see the story and feel the emotions, which are universal emotions, to understand what's going on, to get the gist. And so the people there were getting the gist. And the other thing that's amazing about Pi is that because it's random, every sequence of numbers possible occurs somewhere in Pi, and occurs an infinite number of times, by the way, because it goes on forever. So that means that at some point in my recitation, people were hearing their telephone numbers. People were hearing their passcodes. People were hearing the numbers on their bank card. Or they were hearing their date of birth. And without knowing it, some of them were hearing the date of their death. And so we say that numbers is the universal language. And I think, these emotions that were coming out of what I was doing were sufficient for people to get the gist, to get this story, and to make, perhaps out of it, their own stories as well. No matter, because I guess as soon as I write a book, I know that it doesn't any longer belong to me. Like, people will interpret it and read it in their own way, and that's fine.
Hello.
Hello.
I just wondered if you had a preferred language for yourself.
Oh, it's difficult because my mum has 9 children, and I think she would hate if someone said to her, "Do you have a preferred child?" You know, she loves them all, but for different reasons, and all different. And for me, it's the same. You know, I have different languages, and I love them for different ways and different reasons. I'm speaking in English now, and it's going very well, apparently. You understand me very well. So I love speaking in English. And when I go back to my hotel, I'll be speaking to my husband in French, and it will be very wonderful. You know, we have all these memories together and 10 years of relationship together. And so, and I love speaking in French. And then when I'm on the phone to my friends in Iceland and I'm using Icelandic or writing with the different characters you have to use on the keyboards to type in Icelandic, because it's a 1,000-year-old language, I love using Icelandic. So it just depends on the people and it depends on the situation. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed
Thank
for that
you.
final
Thank
question.
you.
Thank you.